Welcome to Restoria. I'm Edward, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story ease you into sleep. The Baker Who Stayed. The cart had a loose wheel, not dangerously loose. Not the kind of loose that stops you in your tracks or sends a crate of sourdough sliding into a ditch. Just loose enough that on certain roads, at certain speeds, it produced a low rhythmic knock that Thomas had learned to hear as a kind of company, a wooden metronome, a traveling companion that asked nothing of him and kept reliable time. He had been meaning to fix it for 3 weeks. The road into Aldenmere came down from the eastern ridge in a long, slow curve, and on a clear morning you could see the village from half a mile away. The church tower first, gray stone catching the early light. Then the rooftops and the smoke from the first chimneys, and eventually the square itself, opening up between the old mill and the row of terraced cottages like a room someone had left the door to. This Tuesday, it was not a clear morning. The rain had started before dawn, somewhere on the ridge road where the trees thinned and the sky opened up and had nothing better to do than empty itself. Thomas had pulled his coat tighter and kept going. He had a canvas sheet over the cart, and the bread was dry, and that was what mattered. His hat was less fortunate. By the time he came down into Aldenmere, the brim was heavy with water and dripping steadily in front of his face like a slow curtain. He set up in the square as he always did, corner nearest the church, back of the cart facing the road so customers could approach from either direction. He had the arrangement down to a routine now, each village with its own particular logic. Aldenmere liked the sourdough early and the sweet rolls later. The older residents came first, before 8. The ones who had been awake since 5 and wanted something warm to carry home. The younger families came after the school run, in a brief, energetic rush that was over almost before it started. He unfolded the small wooden sign and set it on the corner of the cart. Thomas Arden Baker, Est, on the road, 19 years ago. That last part was his own addition, painted over the original text one winter when he'd had time and felt like being honest. The rain did not let up. By 9 o'clock he had sold a respectable amount. Not a full morning's worth, not yet. But the sourdough was nearly gone and the rye loaves were moving well. People came out despite the rain, though they came differently. Faster. Hoods up, coins ready, bread tucked under an arm and away again before they'd quite finished their sentence. Rain does that. It makes people efficient in a way that fine weather never quite manages. Thomas didn't mind. He had a small awning that unfolded from the cart's side and kept the worst of it off his head, and he had long ago made peace with damp. 19 years on the road teaches you which things are worth fighting and which things you simply wear. He was rewrapping a tray of almond pastries when he heard the wheel, not the traveling knock, the familiar one, something different. A lower sound, a settling, as if the cart had decided to sit down. He looked and saw what had happened immediately. The loose wheel had finally given up its long argument with the axle and shifted, not fallen. Just shifted, tilting the cart a few degrees to the left and making it abundantly clear that it was going nowhere until someone attended to it properly. Thomas stood looking at it for a moment in the rain. Then he laughed. A short, quiet laugh, more breath than sound. He had been meaning to fix it for 3 weeks, and now the wheel had taken the decision out of his hands. He went to the back of the cart and took out the small wooden toolbox he kept wedged behind the flour sacks. It was a good toolbox, old and battered, with a lid that didn't quite close and a satisfying weight that meant it always had what you needed. He crouched beside the wheel and began to assess the situation. It was fixable. An hour, maybe a little more. He would need to find something to prop the axle while he worked, and there was a bolt that had worked itself loose that wanted replacing, and the whole thing would need to be seated properly before he trusted it on the ridge road home. But it was fixable. He had fixed worse in worse weather, in more inconvenient places. He stood and looked around the square. Aldenmere on a rainy Tuesday morning was not a bustling place. The market that filled the square on Saturdays was absent, the stalls and their cheerful chaos replaced by empty cobblestone and rain. A dog was sitting in a doorway across the square looking at him with the philosophical patience of a creature that had long ago accepted the weather. A woman in a yellow raincoat cycled past without looking up, her wheels sending up small arcs of water. From the bakery 2 streets over, the one Thomas had been carefully not thinking about since he arrived, came the smell of something warm. There was a pub on the north side of the square, the Wheat Sheaf, low-fronted old timber, the sign creaking faintly in the wet air. Thomas had been in once or twice over the years for a coffee in the cold months. It occurred to him now that they might have a length of timber he could borrow, something to prop the axle. It also occurred to him that a coffee would not go amiss. He locked the cart, pulled his hat down, and crossed the square. The Wheat Sheaf smelled of wood smoke and old carpet, and the particular settled warmth of a place that has been opening its doors since before anyone currently alive can remember. There were 3 people inside. A man at the bar with a newspaper folded to the crossword. An elderly woman by the window nursing what appeared to be a very small sherry. And behind the bar, drying glasses with a cloth, a woman Thomas thought he had seen before but wasn't entirely sure. She looked up when he came in. She had dark hair pulled back and the kind of face that paid attention, not in an intrusive way, in the way that some people have of making you feel the room got slightly more focused when they looked at you. He asked about the timber. She came out from behind the bar without any fuss and took him through to a storeroom at the back where there were, among other useful things, several lengths of wood in various states of usefulness. She held them up one by one, and they agreed on a good one together, which took about 4 minutes and involved no wasted conversation. Her name was Ruth. She had run the pub for 6 years. She had grown up in a village on the other side of the ridge and come to Aldenmere after her marriage ended, which she mentioned in the same tone you'd mention having moved from one county to another, factual and without drama. Thomas offered his own brief account. On the road since his late 20s, no fixed address, a different square every morning, approximately. She made him a coffee without being asked, and brought it out to the cart, which he thought was unexpected and said so. She said she had been watching the wheel list to the left for the past 20 minutes from the pub window and had been wondering when he'd notice. He worked on the wheel and she stood under the awning, watching, not helping, which he found he didn't mind. Some people help in a way that means they need to be managed, which turns assistance into a second job. Ruth just watched. occasionally handing him something when it became obvious he needed it without him having to say so. The rain eased a little around 10, not stopped, but softened. The square took on a different quality, the cobblestones reflecting the gray sky in long silver shapes. The dog in the doorway across the way had not moved. A child ran through the square in a red coat, jumping a puddle with serious commitment, and disappeared down a side street. Thomas sold 3 more loaves while he worked. People would come over, look at the situation with the wheel, buy bread, sometimes say something sympathetic about the rain or the axle, and go on their way. One older man stayed for a while and told him at length about a similar incident with a tractor in 1972 that had kept him in a particular field for the better part of a day. Thomas listened properly. He had learned that this was what people wanted, more often than not. Not a solution, just someone to receive the story. Ruth went back inside at some point and came back with a plate. 2 slices of toast with butter and a thick-cut marmalade that Thomas ate standing up, which she seemed entirely unbothered by. He asked if she'd made the marmalade. She said her mother had. Last January. She always made too much, and Ruth had been working through it since February. He said it was extraordinary. He meant it. There was something in it beyond the orange, something almost floral, and he told her so. She said her mother threw lavender in sometimes, just a little. An accident the first time, apparently, that turned out to be an improvement. He thought about that while he finished the toast. By 11, the wheel was done. He had taken his time with it, more time than strictly necessary, which he was aware of and chose not to examine too closely. The bolt was replaced, the axle seated properly, the whole assembly tightened to a standard that would see him through several weeks of ridge roads without complaint. He stood and cleaned his hands on a cloth and looked at the cart, which sat level and right for the first time in 3 weeks. There was still bread left, not much. A few rye loaves, the almond pastries, a small sourdough he'd been keeping back that was still warm from the early morning. He sold the sourdough to a woman with a pram, who stopped and looked at it for a long time before deciding, which he had learned was usually a sign that someone was deciding between something they wanted and something they felt they should want. He waited. She bought the sourdough. Ruth came back out around 11:30 with 2 cups of coffee and the straightforward manner of someone who has decided something without making a production of it. They sat on the 2 low steps at the front of the wheat sheaf and drank the coffee and watched the square. The rain had almost stopped. The sky was still a deep, even gray, but there was a softness to it now, the kind that precedes light rather than refuses it. The cobblestones were steaming slightly where the temperature had shifted. Thomas found he wasn't thinking about much. That didn't happen often. His mind was usually somewhere slightly ahead of him, the next village, the next road, the next morning's bake. But sitting on those steps with the warm cup in both hands and the smell of rain on old stone all around him, there was no particular next. Just the square and the coffee and the woman next to him who was apparently also not thinking about much. He said, eventually, that he was usually gone by 10. She said she had noticed that. Over the past few months, he asked if he came through often enough to be noticeable. She said he came through every 3rd Tuesday and had done for as long as she could remember, and that the loose wheel had been visible from the pub window for approximately 3 weeks. He looked at her. She looked at the square. He said he had been meaning to fix it. She said she knew. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The dog across the square had finally moved, resettling itself in a slightly different position in the doorway, as if making a considered adjustment. A gust moved through and sent a few drops from the awning edge down onto the cobblestones. Thomas drank the last of his coffee. He had a route to keep. The next village was Casterham, 8 miles west, and he had 3 loaves and a tray of pastries that still needed selling, and a ridge road that would be soft from the rain and want careful driving. He had a schedule of a kind. The kind that doesn't exist on paper but exists in the accumulated expectation of people in certain squares on certain mornings who count on you to come. He said he ought to get going. Ruth said, of course. He packed the remaining bread, folded the awning, returned the timber to her with thanks. She took it without ceremony. He climbed onto the cart and took up the reins and the horse. A steady gray mare named Patience, who had been indifferent to the entire morning's events, moved forward with her customary lack of drama. He got to the edge of the square and stopped. It was not a dramatic stop. He didn't stand up or make any kind of gesture. He just stopped and sat and looked at the road ahead for a moment. Then he turned the cart around. He went back across the square to the wheat sheaf and stopped again outside and sat there feeling slightly foolish in a way he decided to ignore. Ruth appeared in the pub doorway. She had the timber under her arm. She looked at him with the attentive expression he was already beginning to think of as simply hers. He said he came through every 3rd Tuesday. She said she knew. He said he wondered if on the next 3rd Tuesday, if she wasn't busy, he might come in rather than just stopping at the cart for coffee. Or for lunch, if that wasn't too much of a suggestion. She considered this for a moment that was just long enough to be genuine rather than performed. She said lunch would be fine. He said good. She said good. He turned the cart back toward the road, and Patience walked on without any fuss at all, as if she had been expecting exactly this and had simply been waiting for the humans to arrive at it in their own time. The square fell behind him. The ridge road rose ahead, soft and gray and steaming gently in the aftermath of rain. The wheel turned smoothly, evenly, without complaint. Thomas Arden, baker, 19 years on the road, did not think about much for the rest of the drive. He didn't need to. Some things, once they are properly fixed, simply work. You stop hearing them. They become part of the rhythm, part of the motion, part of the ordinary, reliable turning of a morning into an afternoon, into whatever comes next. He let Patience set her own pace. The ridge opened out above the valley, and below him Aldenmere sat quiet in the lifting rain, the church tower just visible, the square a pale gray shape between the rooftops, and somewhere in it a pub with a creaking sign and a plate of toast that had tasted of an accident that turned out to be an improvement. He would be back in 3 weeks. He was already looking forward to it. The road curved east, and the rain stopped entirely. And somewhere above the clouds, the sun was doing what it always eventually did, working its quiet way back toward a sky that had never really intended to stay gray. Patience walked on, the wheel turned, and Thomas, for the first time in a long time, was in no particular hurry to arrive.